Demos is the ancient Greek word for people, and so democracy literally translates as rule by the people. Now, what this actually encompasses has been fiercely debated since ancient times, but in the modern era, we distinguish between direct democracy, such as in referendums, where everybody gets to say on the legislative proposal, and representative democracy, where we elect representatives, such as members of parliament, to make legislative decisions on our behalf. Now, according to Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union, the European Union is meant to be based on representative democracy, but in the last 10, 20 years, or maybe really since the European Union was founded, the democratic credentials of the European Union as an international organisation have been really called into question. And so that's what we're going to look at in this lecture today. Now, if you get a question in an exam or a coursework along the lines of to what extent is there a democratic deficit in the European Union, there's probably a few ways you can go about it. But what we're going to do today is look at the key institutions of the European Union and examine the extent to which each of those is democratic or could be said to be democratic. And then at the end, we'll look at some of the other treaty articles that you may have seen in other parts of your course and examine how they contribute to democratic life in the European Union. Right, let's get started. So democracy is quite a broad term, and it's quite useful to narrow it down a little bit. I've put a few aspects of democracy here, and these are perhaps factors that you might like to consider as we're going through the lecture and think about how they relate to each of the institutions that we describe. So first of all, accountability. To what extent are institutions or commissioners or representatives held to account for the decisions that they make? Legitimacy. In other words, what authority or mandate do the people have to actually make those decisions? And also transparency. So when they make a decision, how easy is it to see not only the decision that they give, but also maybe the reasons for that decision as well. So a few things to bear in mind as we go through. Now, as I said in the introduction, the Treaty on European Union really introduces us to this idea of representative democracy. And Article 10 actually goes further and talks about introducing political parties as well. We'll speak a little bit more about this when we discuss the European Parliament, but just worth bearing in mind that this is enshrined in treaty as well. Article 11 of the Treaty on European Union is to do with the EU and its relationship directly with the people. Article 11 was quite interesting because it gave the idea of citizens' initiatives, in other words, ways for groups of citizens to directly engage with the legislative process of the European Union. So another attempt to establish a more direct form of democracy within the European Union between the people and the institutions. Article 12 in the meantime deals with the relationship between national parliaments and the European Union, often seen as being very important and a close relationship to maintain. It also talks about the principle of subsidiarity as well, and this is the idea that the European Union should only legislate in areas where it's better for the European Union to act as a group rather than for member states to act individually. So for example, in an area like defence, it's always going to be better for the UK to decide how its military should be used, and so that is a matter for the UK to decide. Other things such as agricultural policy, it's decided that the EU is in a better position to set standards across all 28 member states, and so that principle is reserved for the European Union. So let's go through the institutions. The Commission is first of all, and it's probably the most interesting institution to discuss because this is where most of the focus for criticism of a democratic deficit has lied for a long time now. And this is important because the role of the Commission, as I've put at the top, is really important. So it's effectively the executive branch of the European Union. It initiates policy and initiates legislation that will eventually become law. So really important in that sense. Also under Article 258, it's responsible for the enforcement of European Union law as well. And CAP stands for Common Agricultural Policy, which is an area of law where, in relation to farming, where most of the European Union budget gets spent. Now, the criticism comes along with this appointment issue that I've put at the bottom of the slide. And so commissioners are nominated by the member states, and there is oversight by the European Parliament, but this generally doesn't extend beyond questioning the potential commissioners. If they did want to vote them out, they'd have to vote out the whole commission, and so there's no real oversight in that sense of the word. And then finally, they are appointed by the council, who we'll look at later on in this lecture. So you can see why there's criticism there, because there's no real engagement with citizens of the European Union in the appointment of this really important body. The European Parliament, which is representative of the citizens, does get a say in this, but it's not really a massive part of the decision. It's mainly between the member states and the EU Council. Now, the presidency works along similar lines as well. So the council will vote for a nominee, and then this is approved by the European Parliament. So the European Parliament does get a veto in terms of who is the president of the Commission, but again, we're really sort of talking about the Council having the biggest say and really calling the shots in terms of who is on the Commission. Now, the Commission is meant to represent the European Union as a whole, and there aren't meant to be national interests at play here, but the reality is that it probably does work like that. And this idea of a presidency has really come under criticism recently, because a lot of people have been asking, well, why can't the people of the European Union directly elect a president? So we're seeing at the moment Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump vying for the presidency of the United States, and that will go to a general election that will be held in November. Why isn't the European Commission presidency run along similar lines, where everybody gets a vote, rather than it really being done behind closed doors as it is at the moment? There have been attempts to democratise the Commission through engagement with civic society, and at the start of the lecture I talked about citizens' initiatives, but for most people this simply hasn't gone far enough. The European Parliament has been directly elected since 1979, so every 5 years there are elections by the people to elect their representatives, as you would in a normal representative democracy. Now, when the European Union first started, the role of the European Parliament was very limited, and it didn't have much power. However, it has increased its powers since 1986 in the Single European Act. So most legislation is now passed through the ordinary legislative procedure, and this basically means that the European Parliament gets a veto on legislation. Also, since 1986, and especially more recently since the Treaty of Lisbon, there's been greater scrutiny of the Commission and the Council by the European Parliament. So it's often argued that the European Parliament is the main focus point of democracy within the European Union. It's really representative democracy at its core. But there is poor voter turnout. So the most recent elections were in 2014, and voter turnout here was at 42.6%, and this has been declining ever since. And in 1999, in the UK at least, more people voted in the final of the television show Big Brother than they did in the European parliamentary elections in the year before. And that was quite a big difference, actually, 11 million to 23 million. And it just shows a lack of engagement by the general public with the European Parliament. People just simply aren't interested in it. There might be reasons for that. So even though you can vote for a Conservative MEP or a Labour MEP or a Green MEP, the party system within the European Parliament is a little bit confusing. So the Conservatives aren't the Conservatives in the European Parliament. They're part of a different party. along with other MEPs from other countries. So there's parties such as the European People's Party that crosses across national barriers. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense to people, and it's a little bit confusing and broad streamed. And I think we can conclude this section on the European Parliament by saying that even though the European Parliament has been given more power, it seems that people are just less and less interested in it as an institution. And this is quite a nice quote from David Schleicher, saying it's like a nervous gambler doubling his bets after a series of losses, trying to double down and say, okay, we'll give you even more power. And people are just saying, no, we're still not interested. This institution doesn't mean anything to us. Now, the EU Council is made up of ministers that represent the national government. So at this point, we can say, well, right, well, the Commission represents the EU as a whole, the Parliament represents the people, and the Council represents national government. So we have links with all of the key players within the European Union by this point. But the role of the council is a little bit confusing. It seems to both play an executive role in the sense that it helps initiate legislation alongside the commission, but it also plays a legislative role as well. It's also part of that co-decision or ordinary legislative procedure that I talked about earlier alongside the European Parliament. And this raises a number of questions to do with separation of powers as well. So is the Council really democratic, or is the European Union as a whole really democratic when the Council can sort of have powers that sit across both lines, executive and legislative as well? The issue of qualified majority voting has also come up in discussions about democracy in the EU as well. Basically, this means that each country has a number of votes based on its population. So big countries like the UK, Germany and France have a lot of votes in the council, whereas small countries such as Malta and Cyprus don't have many votes because they have fewer population. Now, this ensures that a majority of the EU population, so the EU citizens, do support pieces of legislation, but it has been criticised as well, on the other hand, because it can discriminate against smaller countries. So the big countries, such as Germany, France, Spain, can gang up on smaller countries, such as the Malta, or even Greece would probably be the best example, given the Eurozone crisis of late. So there is the possibility for discrimination there as well, so bear that in mind. Finally, the judicial branch of the European Union is obviously represented by the Court of Justice. There's one judge from each member state, so all member states are represented, although the idea is that each judge should put aside national interest and work in the interest of the European Union. Now, one of the interesting arguments that has been made in relation to the Court of Justice has been in terms of whether they do interpret the law, which is what a court should do, or whether the Court of Justice is actually making new law and so going beyond its remit and actually acting as almost like a legislative body. Now, I think this is probably overall an unfair criticism. There have been times when the Court of Justice has overstepped the mark, but these are quite few and far between, and generally the Court of Justice does tend to work quite well. So finally, before we finish, let's think about some of the other articles that you may have come across on your European Union law syllabus and think how they relate to democracy in the EU. So Article 20 is to do with citizenship, and everyone is a citizen of the European Union. And this is seen as quite a good thing because it's mainly based on rights rather than duties. So if you see my lecture on European Union citizenship, you'll see that there are a number of rights associated with it. However, this isn't to say that there aren't duties associated with being a European Union citizen. It's just that because of things like direct effect that we'll look at in a minute, and direct applicability, the obligations associated with EU citizenship are more indirect. Linked to Article 20 is Article 45, free movement of workers, which also allows for free travel around the European Union as well. So this can lead to greater cultural integration simply because it's easier to move across the European Union. You can go and visit Italy or Greece or Spain or those other cultural centres of the European Union and feel integrated and part of that, which does help to contribute to democracy in some indirect sense. Article 263 allows for judicial review, and this allows ordinary European Union citizens to challenge pieces of legislation that go beyond the competence of the treaties or beyond the competence of the institutions making them. This is obviously quite a good thing, but one of the main criticisms is it's very difficult for individuals to prove that they have standing in a case. So we'll look at ploughman, for example, would be a good example of where non-privileged applicants will struggle to bring a case for judicial review. So exercising that right is very difficult. Direct effect as well, so European Union law can be applied in national courts, which essentially brings the idea of European Union law home to people so they can apply it within their own courts. They don't have to go to the Court of Justice to get a decision. Obviously that relates to Van Gendenloos. And then finally we have Article 267, which is the preliminary reference procedure. Again, this is linking national courts to the European courts and ensuring that there is that link in place between the two, which does help to maintain democracy in some sense, because it ensures that European Union law is applied consistently across all 28 member states. The EU is by no means a perfect democracy, but on the other hand, it isn't completely undemocratic either. If you're writing an essay on this question in a coursework or an exam, you'll probably want to lean towards one side or the other in your conclusion. But one tip that I would give you is to maybe think about ways that the EU could become more democratic. So think about things like a directly elected president, for example, that we talked about, more direct engagement with citizens as well. What are the flaws of democracy in the EU and how can they be resolved? That's the way to get top marks, I think, when you're concluding each section of your work. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions, comments, queries, then leave them below and I'll definitely try and get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Bye.